All right, well, let me pray before we start. God in heaven, we give you thanks that we can be together, and we ask your blessing on our time here. Give us the insight that we need to learn, to teach, and to minister and disciple those around us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Hey, anybody want to give it a shot on how you might ask somebody about doing a study?
Would you like to do a Bible study?
That's great. Would you like to do a Bible study? That's a great... How would you get to that point? At what point would you feel comfortable saying to somebody, hey, would you like to do a Bible study?
I think after you've had some conversations with them and, maybe you've discussed some topics and if they're at least opening to having the discussion,
Yeah.
then you maybe take that next step and let's, maybe we can sit down together.
Good.
I think it depends on the point where you're at in that relationship.
Sure. So after a few discussions with somebody, and you remember the context of this class is very much those who are seeking to learn, okay? People that come to church already. Maybe it's a friend of yours that you know is interested in spiritual things. You know they go to church somewhere else. You've got a little bit of a relationship with them, or somebody that you've had some discussions with and you feel a good time to say, hey, would you like to do a Bible study? Any other ways you might ask somebody how to do a Bible study? Or if they'd like to do a Bible study?
Ask you a question about it.
Okay, so if they ask you a question, that's an open door. Say, well, hey, that's one question. I'm sure you've got a bunch of questions. We've got a Bible study that really addresses a lot of the basics of Christianity. Good. Joe?
Well, it's like, we're fishers of men. So really, you throw it out there, and you got a little bite back, and then you might go a little while, throw it out again.
Great.
And it really is. It is.
Good. So bit by bit sometimes, introducing it. Good. All right. A number of weeks ago, we had a husband and wife start coming to church here at Millwood. And they were invited by one of the ladies in the church, Patty, and a neighbor, one of her new neighbors in Apple Valley. She invited them to church. They start coming. We've had a variety of conversations over the past couple of months with them. And Patty, how did you ask them to do a study? How did that come up?
You threw me under the bus.
Oh, I did. I did. We were talking. I said, hey, Patty could start doing a study with you. And Patty was like, well, sure, I'd be happy to. But she and Jared started the Bible study last night with this couple, Doug and Sandy. And we baptized them this afternoon.
Awesome.
Now, that's a
Quick Bible study.
A great story, a powerful Bible study. But let's back up a little bit and see how that happened. They were already very interested in the church. She has a background in the Christian church. He has some handicaps that limit his abilities. And so they've had a great interest. They love the church. They want to be a part of the church. They wanted to place their membership. And we felt that we really need to make sure here on some things here. So last night they got together and they went through Sandy's timeline. And what were some of the things that came up in the timeline and maybe some of the questions or conversation, Patty?
When she stated that she was baptized for the first time when she was 13 years old, and as we went on discussing it, the only thing that she could remember from her baptism was that it was a guy in a white robe that baptized her. And that was the only thing that she could remember about her baptism. I know most of us can remember every detail of her baptism, so it kind of flagged me, so that's when I asked her, do you feel like you were baptized for the right reasons at that point? And then that's when it made her think.
Good. And neither one of them got any sleep last night. And Patty was up through the night worrying about it. And Sandy contacted her today and said she wanted to be baptized. Okay. Now, this was a situation with a little bit of urgency, I would say, because they were ready to place their membership. They were eager. They want to start serving as soon as possible. They love what's going on here at Millwood. So they start going through this timeline, and the trigger that Patty caught on to there was that she only remembers a guy in a white robe doing the baptism, the preacher at the church she went to. And so they begin a discussion about what are the right reasons to do baptism? Is it okay to not remember the reasons you were baptized? Do you need to know the reason for baptism in order to be saved? And that discussion went on through the evening. Go ahead.
And could you, and another one of her questions was, is it okay to be baptized twice?
Yeah. Can you be baptized twice? So some of those questions might come up in the course of doing a Bible study with somebody. That timeline really triggered for Jared and Patty, here's some things that we need to address, okay? And they were able to address them obviously very quickly. She has an understanding of baptism. She's been going here for a while. She's heard sermons. We've talked about it before. So they were at a good point where they were ready to be baptized. That might be something, as you learn about that in the timeline, that you're like, oh, she was baptized when she was a young girl. Do you know why you were baptized? You really don't know why. What do you remember about it? You don't remember much? Okay. Well, we're going to have a study on baptism, and we'll dig into that, and we'll answer any questions you might have. Okay? If you feel like you need to go right to that baptism study, then go right to that baptism study, the study on salvation. There's no rules that would limit you from doing that. Now, keep in mind this. Our objective is not to baptize people. Our objective is to disciple people and to make them disciples that make disciples, that they become good and strong Christians. And so we want them to understand who God is, the authority of the Bible, who Jesus is and what Jesus did. They need to understand repentance and living for Christ, and all of that will come up in the course of the study. But if you feel they're at that point where they're ready to talk salvation, then we go there, okay? We don't want to necessarily delay that at all. There would be great regret on many sides if that were to happen. So what a great example of those two just digging in, dealing with an issue that was very key and important, and we got it addressed today. We dealt with it, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. So last week when we talked about the timeline, Andrea shared her story with us, and there were some things there that she noted over the course of that. Anybody else want to share their story from the timeline? Just the highlights of your spiritual journey thus far? You don't have to. Okay? So that's what you want to do. Your first study, you're going to sit down with somebody. Let's go through your timeline, talk about it, ask questions, see if they have any key questions about it. And then I would suggest as well, you share your story at some point that first night you get together. Okay? So it might go something like this. The person shares their story about going to church as a young child. They don't remember going to church after maybe the age of 10 years old. They never became a Christian. They got married when they were 20 years old, started having kids, and now they're in their 20s. They're getting back to church, and they want to figure out how to get their kids into church and make sure their kids are going to Sunday school. That's a motivation for young people sometimes. And so out of that, what have we learned about that person?
There's somewhat of a spiritual background.
Yeah,
there.
very little background, maybe until the time of 10. So they might know the basics about Jesus. They probably, maybe you could say, well, did you go to church at all after you were 10? Oh, yeah, I used to go with my grandma every summer. So 2 or 3 months out of the year, I would go to church. Oh, okay. What did you learn while you were going to church there? Where did you go to church? Oh, okay. You sort of just go along there, and you begin to learn what they know about the Bible. Say, hey, before we go on, I just want to share my story with you briefly, and I think we have a lot in common, if you do. We're not just going to throw that out there. But maybe your story goes something like this. Yeah, I didn't grow up going to church until I was about 15 years old, and I met a guy in high school, a friend of mine. He invited me to go to church one day with him, and I went, and I heard the preaching, and I went to a revival a couple weeks later, and this guy named Ray Bennett was there. And man, I'd never heard the Bible presented like that. And they began to study with me, just like the study we're doing here. This isn't my story for the record, hypothetical here. And then I fell away shortly after that. And then when I got into my 20s, my wife and I had kids, and we wanted to get our kids in Sunday school too, and it's the best thing that's ever happened to us. And however that story for you plays out, okay? But share your story as well. You don't want to do a game of one-upsmanship. Oh, you were a drunk for 15 years? I've been a drunk for 18 years before I met Jesus. None of that kind of stuff. Just a brief story. That's why it's important for you to go through that outline for yourself. And just like Andrea did, maybe in 2 minutes, last week was able to share her history in the faith. Very important. So we are at week 1. You're doing the timeline with the individual. Once you're done with the timeline, at that point, I would say introduce where you're going to head with the study, where you're going to go with the study. So we just wanted to get a background with each other on our spiritual background. And before I go today, I'd like to watch a 15-minute video, the first session here. It's lesson number 1 in your book, and watch that video together with them, okay? And before you leave then, the video is 15 minutes long, and you guys didn't even watch the video last night,
No,
right?
we ran out of time.
Because I ran out of
Way
time,
over.
which is fine. Be careful about getting in a box with all of this, okay? You've got to go with the person. Figure out where they are spiritually. You don't want them to lead you down rabbit trails, but at the same time, you don't want them to feel like, well, I have a lot of questions nobody's answering. He keeps coming every week, and I'm not getting anywhere because I really have some issues I want to talk about. There's going to be a time for that. But before you leave, I would suggest you this. Okay, so here's your homework for the week. Do you promise you'll do homework every time we get together? It'll be easy, I promise. Oh, sure, I'll do my homework. Okay? Well, your homework is to go back and review lesson 1, look up the scriptures, and it's written in your book there, I believe, what the homework is. Look through the scriptures. And before I go, I just want to get an understanding of your view of the Bible, what you know about the Bible. Are you really familiar with the Bible? Somewhat. I've had one on my coffee table for 30 years. Oh, do you read it much? No, I haven't read it probably in 20 years. Oh, okay. Well, just so you know, if you're ever looking for a book of the Bible, the easiest way to do that is go to the table of contents. And every Bible is going to have one at the beginning. The books of the Bible are going to be listed there alphabetically, starting with Amos, or Acts, and then Amos. So they're going to be listed there, and if you're looking for a book of the Bible, it'll tell you which page number to go to. The Bible's broken up into 2 sections. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament's important, but the most important thing we want to grab a hold of in the next few weeks is the New Testament and what the New Testament says about living for Jesus or becoming a Christian. So if you will, just do your homework this week. If you want to include, if they're not going to church on a regular basis, and would you come to church with me on Sunday? I think it'd be really important for you in this process. I'm not really into church. Okay, that's all right now. At some point, though, in the next 5 weeks, do you promise you'll come to church with me? Maybe. Okay, deal. That's the kind of direction or tact that you might want to take with somebody along those lines. If you're doing it with somebody, let's say, from work. If they have, I may have mentioned this a couple weeks ago, if they have a King James version of the Bible, which I find very frequently, people have King James versions that they were given when they were 15, 10, 5, when they got married, that their kid got at VBS. Don't be overly critical. Oh, yeah, that thing's like 500 years old. You don't want to use that. Let me give you a new modern version. And we've got paperback versions of the New American Standard that you can leave with them if they want it. If they don't, that's okay. If they're comfortable with the King James, that's great. It's a good Bible. Okay, if they feel comfortable reading it. All right. Any questions on that? All right. Now let's talk about, for a second, frequency of meeting with people. Ideally, you can do it every week. Okay. Set up a regular time every Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. Will that work for you, Justin? Yeah, great. Well, then I'll see you next Tuesday at 7, right? Sometimes you might find that people have schedules that are just really pushing it, and maybe every other week with them would be appropriate. In some cases, it may be situations where many of you are in this situation. Man, I don't get home till 7 o'clock every night of the week. How about we meet for breakfast on Saturdays? Would that work for you? Maybe that doesn't even work for them. Why don't you come to church, and after church, we'll go out to eat together. Annie did that with Lynn Kelly this year, where they get together after church, and that's when they did their Bible study. If it needs to be during Sunday school, no problem with that. If that's the only time you can meet with them, you're welcome to use my office or find a corner of the building somewhere to meet with them, or sit out in the car, or go down to Spearman's, okay? Not trying to detract from the importance of Sunday school, but we have to keep in mind the importance of them becoming Christians, okay? And we want to accommodate to the best of our ability their schedule. At the same time, we want to keep in mind that if anybody's going to follow Jesus, they have to pick up their cross and follow him. That means sacrifice, you know, and we don't want to make it overly easy, but we do want to be accommodating, especially for those that aren't there yet as Christians, you know, just doing what we can to study with people where they're at when they're there. A couple other things then, very introductory type stuff with this study to keep in mind. So you've gone through your first Bible study with them. Before you got there, they did the timeline. You've talked about your timelines. You've watched the introduction of that video. They can follow along and fill in the blanks in their book with that video. You've talked about the Bible, when you're going to meet again, and you leave. Call them in a couple days. You know, midway through the week. Hey, just called to see how you're doing. Your week going okay? Oh, good. You've been able to start your homework yet? What I've discovered is most people don't do their homework till the night before or the hour before I show up. Okay? That's just inevitably what happens. But call them, encourage them. Do you have any questions on anything that we talked about? Okay. Any big plans for the weekend? Oh. Well, before I hang up, let me ask you, is there anything I can pray for you about? And I'll add that to my prayer list and begin praying for them. And of course, include prayer in that first session. I didn't say that, but always close in prayer with your Bible studies. What you're trying to do there is you're trying to develop a friendship, a connection with them. You want to be that person for them that when they have a question about church, they call you. When they hear there's some sort of fellowship group meal, they call you. And you say, yeah, there is, Saturday. I'll pick you up at 6:30 or whatever time. You want to build that kind of friendship with them where you're able to have a rapport with them so that when you get to that point of talking about their faith and some very personal issues, for them may be very personal, you want to have some trust built between the two of you. And you do that by seeking to become their friend, reaching out to them, inviting them to different things. If you know something's going on at the church, then invite them to that. If you and your family are going to have a cookout Friday evening, and you feel comfortable and you want to invite that person over, do that. You know, that's up to you. But praying for them is going to be important as well. And any questions on that? But midweek contact is really helpful. And I would say this, not just midweek contact at church, but text or call them, you know, at some other point, and let them know that you're thinking about them not just on spiritual terms, but on friendly terms as well. Do you have something, Patty?
Now, just thinking, you said you needed to do a closing prayer. Shouldn't you also do an opening prayer?
Sure.
And a prayer at the beginning too as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't always, you know, but sometimes I just don't think. Here's what happens sometimes. You just start talking. You show up at their house. You haven't seen them in a couple days. Oh, really? This happened? Oh, that's cool. That's cool. We better get started here. All right, what page were we on? And next thing you know, you're in your study. I'm not saying prayer's not important, of course, but I don't think God will be disappointed if you forget to. But having time of prayer is good. Okay? Any thoughts or questions on that so far? Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the value or benefits of having a second person with you. I think what Patty and Jared experienced last night was really, really important with that. What are some benefits of having another person going with you to do these Bible studies?
One picks up on something that somebody else may not.
Yeah, so one is maybe more in tune with something that was said. Good.
You've always got a witness, so that, I mean, you know, whether I said this or didn't say that, or, you know, then it eliminates confusion.
Sure. Yeah, there's some accountability there and somebody that can, at times, and this is important too, even critique you. Jared did that with me this summer. You know, we'd make some calls, and on the way out, he would say, hey, why didn't you ask him this question? I'm like, why didn't you ask it when we were in there? You know, but that kind of give and take, I think, is helpful with another person. Sometimes the other person is able to better connect with that individual. And so maybe it's not you who calls them midweek, but maybe it's the other person that calls, you know. Hey, I noticed that you guys really seem to have a lot together, you know, in common. Why don't you give them a call on Tuesday and see how they're doing? Ask them what you can pray about for them. What I found at times, too, having a second person helps to get you back on track. Sometimes, and those of you, and many of you have asked me questions over the years, and my guess is after 30 seconds, you're like, stop. You know, it's easy to just, somebody asks a question and you're like way over here. And sometimes it's helpful to have somebody say, hey, Dave, they were asking about this. What? You sort of got off topic. Why don't you answer that question? You know? So having that person can help get you back on track. That other person can ask clarifying questions that you didn't think about. You know, maybe you said something. I've had this happen plenty of times where maybe I'll say something in a sermon or a lesson or in a Bible study, and somebody will come up to me afterwards. They'll say, hey, did you mean to say what you said? You know, did you really mean to say that? No, I didn't. You know, so that kind of person can say, hey, Dave, you just said Moses. Did you mean Abraham? Oh, yeah, I meant Abraham. That kind of stuff. Just simple stuff even like that. That other person can sometimes serve as the person that looks up the Bible verse. You know, you're sitting there and you're talking to this person and you're sort of in this, you know, you're having a good spiritual conversation with an individual, you know, and a verse comes to mind and you're like, oh, hey, Jeremiah, would you look up that verse? It's the verse about not judging other people. Would you look that up for me? And while we continue our conversation, he's able to look it up, okay? That's always helpful there as well. Sometimes, and this is incredibly helpful, that other person handles distractions for you. When I mentioned a study with a couple earlier, a young couple, they had a daughter that was probably 5 at the time. Reagan, my daughter, who was 9 or 10 at the time, she would go with me every week. And she would take that girl into the playroom and they would play dolls for 45 minutes. That was a huge relief because that girl was very clingy to mom and dad. But she loved Reagan. And so that worked out really well. I've taken the boys with me before, the older girls as well. So if you've got somebody like that that can play with the kids, serve as a, quote, babysitter. Ann Russell and I, a few years ago, there was a family that she was working with the girls and I was working with the dad. And small house, and it turned out just a lot of distraction. Annie was able to take the 3 daughters away and study with them at her house, maybe 5 minutes away. And I was able to stay at the house and study with the dad. That worked out really well. So be creative in those areas. Find somebody that can help you if you need it in those ways. There's going to be a lot of distractions. While we're on that topic, I was asked this question this week: what about women teaching men? You know, the ideal situation is men teach men, women teach women. Okay? Let's go to Acts chapter 18 briefly. Look at a great example here of a husband and wife that were working together to disciple an individual. Acts chapter 18, start in verse 24. Acts 18:24. Now a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came to Ephesus, and he was mighty in the Scriptures. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wanted to go across to Achaia, the brethren encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. And when he had arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public and demonstrated that Jesus was the Christ. And then in chapter 19, it happened that while Apollos was at Corinth, Paul passed through the upper country and came to Ephesus and found some disciples, and Apollos ultimately is baptized. He'd only received the baptism of John. The key verse I want you to look at up there, it says at the end of verse 26, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately, okay? Here's one man, and it says they instructed him, okay? It is incredibly appropriate, even for a woman at work, if it's just you and a guy sitting across from you in the factory. He has a question about the Bible. It is fine for you to answer that question. If he asks you the question, how do I become a Christian? You better tell him how to become a Christian. Don't pull out the old, well, women aren't supposed to be teaching men. I'm going to go get somebody to, I don't have anybody to teach you. Okay? Don't panic. Just say what you know. Okay? That is okay. That is okay. Now, the ideal situation is men teach men, women teach women. But if you're in a situation, let's say Andrea and I are doing a Bible study with, we'll pick on John next. We're doing a Bible study. I'm at John's house. Andrea is there. John has a young dog that needs some babysitting, and so Andrea takes the dog occasionally. She's just sitting in the corner over there, and John and I are talking, and something comes up, and I'm like, and this happens a lot with Andrea and I. She has a better memory than me. I'll say, well, I know there's a verse that speaks about a certain topic. Andrea, what is that? And she's like, yeah, this is that verse, and this is what it means. I hope she would do that in that setting and in that situation. That is okay, okay? So be careful about being what I'll call ultra concerned in that situation. If you have the opportunity to teach in those settings, that is quite okay, all right? So you want to be careful, of course. We don't want to, quote, usurp authority and take charge of the meeting or anything like that. But especially if it's couples and couples working together, husband and wife, there's going to be a dynamic conversation going on between the four of you. It's not just going to be the guy talking to the guy, the woman talking to the woman. So I think those settings are okay. Any thoughts or questions on that?
I think that what really matters is the believer and non-believer. If we're instructed through the Great Commission to go teach, baptize, and teach, Reagan could, if I was an unbeliever, Reagan can teach me and explain Jesus Christ to me if I was an unbeliever, even though she's female and I'm male. To me, that's the criteria you can follow. And there would be no question, correct?
Yeah. And I would say we see it in our Sunday school classes. Even Christian women sharing something with the whole class that includes men. They're not seeking to usurp authority. They're not literally teaching the class. There have been times maybe where individuals, and this can be true of men, overtake the class, and the next thing you know, the teacher feels like he's getting bumped out of the way. That can happen. We just have to use discretion in those situations. But if you have the opportunity to share with a non-Christian the truth of Scripture, you share that truth of Scripture. Okay? Any other thoughts or questions on that? All right. Now, it doesn't mean that, a woman should now start looking for all the guys to do private Bible studies with either. I'm talking about in a particular setting, I think that is appropriate. And one of the keys, again, is having somebody with you to help in the course of the Bible study to handle those kinds of distractions.
I think that would help relieve some stress too, because like if somebody's asking you questions and maybe you're just having a Alzheimer's type of day, and
Yeah.
you can't, that other person can jump in and take that straight, like, oh, well, that's right here, and it kind of, you don't feel like you have to answer every